Good morning, everybody. Welcome. All right, folks, good morning. We are going to get started. My name is Sara Freshley, and I am the Community Organizer and Volunteer Coordinator for Friends of Casco Bay. Friends of Casco Bay's mission is to improve and protect the health of Casco Bay. And we are joined this morning by the Island Institute. And this morning we will be discussing the Maine Climate Action Plan and how you can get involved and get your voice heard in this next round of policy recommendations. So to kick us off, I am going to introduce Friends of Casco Bay's Casco Baykeeper Ivy Frignoca. Good morning, Ivy.
Morning, Sarah. Good morning, everyone. I know people are still logging on, but we have a lot to get through, so I'm going to get started. Heather, would you please advance to the next slide? So I'm just going to leap right into it. This is a little different than our other coffees with the Casco Baykeeper, but we have a lot to get through and we want to leave enough time for your questions. So in 2019, the legislature, with overwhelming bipartisan support, passed the Maine Climate Council bill. And that bill required the state to convene a climate council and to every 4 years create a climate action plan. So the first plan was developed in 2020, and that plan was based on prior efforts that the state had done and people in the private sector had done to act on climate. And it was called Maine Won't Wait. And then this year, at the end of this year, the next plan is due out. And that plan is supposed to be an update of the 2020 plan. In both instances, the goals of the plan are to identify the priority actions to be taken over a 4-year period of time. So it's not every single thing that needs to be done to respond to climate change, it's priority actions. Next slide, please. So the way the Climate Council works is that people are appointed to serve on the Climate Council, and the goal is to have broad representation so all of Maine's people and voices for their resources are heard. And the Climate Council has 2 subcommittees that sit under it. The Science and Technical Subcommittee, which Dr. Susie Arnold, who you'll hear from soon, co-chairs. And that committee has the overwhelming task of every 4 years reviewing all of the most current scientific literature, all of the data, and putting together an updated report so that whatever climate action plan is developed is based on the best available science and the best forecasts of future conditions at the time. Also under the Climate Council, there's an equity subcommittee, and they're tasked with ensuring that all recommendations in the climate action plan are equitable to all of Maine's people. And then the way these recommendations get developed is that there are 6 working groups, and each working group for this iteration of the Climate Council was tasked with meeting from January through June of this year and then providing their recommendations to the Climate Council. Next slide, please. So the working group that we are focused on today is the Coastal and Marine Working Group, which all 3 of the speakers serve on, and we did in 2020 so as well. So all of us are have experience with the Climate Council from the beginning of its inception, and so please do feel free to ask us questions. The Coastal Marine Working Group was co-chaired by Carl Wilson, who's the Director of Marine Science at the Department of Marine Resources, and Kurt Brown, who owns Reddy Seafood, which is the largest lobster processing facility in Maine. Next slide, please. This is just to quickly let you see the range of people who serve on the Maine Climate Council and the diversity of expertise. And behind each of these people, there are also a lot of conversations with our colleagues outside of the Climate Council, and there were people who attended Climate Council meetings who also helped to develop the recommendations. Next slide, please. So the Coastal Marine Working Group, the way that we did our work is we broke into subcommittees based on areas of expertise. And those subcommittees looked at the 2020 report, thought about the recommendations that were in there, thought about new strategies and priorities that needed to be incorporated, and then updates to the prior priorities. And we made our recommendations into 3 themes. These are the 3 themes. Susie will talk with you about the first theme. Nick will talk with you about the second, and I will talk with you about the third theme. We've made our recommendations to the Climate Council. Now is the time for public input on the recommendations. That's the purpose of this webinar. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Susie Arnold so she can take you through some of the background science related to the coastal marine recommendations and then the first theme.
Thanks very much, Ivy. Good morning, everybody. My name is Susie. I'm the Senior Ocean Scientist at the Island Institute. I'm also joined by my colleague, Nick Battista from the Island Institute. He's our Chief Policy Officer. One quick reminder for folks, if you aren't familiar with the Island Institute, we are a 41-year-old community development organization. We're based in Rockland, Maine. Our mission is to boldly navigate climate and economic change with island and coastal communities to expand opportunities and deliver solutions. So as Ivy mentioned, I co-chair the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee, and we have recently released our 2024 scientific assessment. It's a comprehensive 250-page report with 9 chapters. It's fairly easy to read. It is a lot of information. There are several chapters that are particularly relevant to this conversation today that I wanted to just highlight for you. There's a chapter on sea level rise and coastal hazards. There's a chapter on marine ecosystems. And importantly, there's also this time around the inclusion of social scientists into the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee. So we have a very robust chapter on the human dimensions of climate change. Much of what is discussed in that chapter is also highly relevant to the conversation today. So I welcome you all to take a look at that. There's a lot of great visuals in there. I'm going to pull out a few of the highlights from the sea level rise and coastal hazards chapter and the marine ecosystems chapter in just the next about 3 minutes to kind of set the stage for what we'll be discussing later. So the idea is that this report comes out early in the climate planning process and kind of backs the process in the latest science. Next slide, please. So one highlight from which was really a low light. So I mean highlight, like high level, important thing coming from the sea level rise and coastal hazards chapter was a lot of data and information about the back-to-back January storms that we all experienced here in Maine, and putting them kind of into context. Now, we know that these storm events broke water levels up and down the Maine coast. So what you're looking at here is the January 10th and 13th storms as compared to the historic storm back in 1978. And I think the key point here is what you're seeing in pink is that backdrop of sea level rise upon which these storms occurred over, which is really the cause for the historic flooding that occurred. So if you look at the blue, that's the tide that occurred. The red is the storm surge that occurred in those 3 storms. And the pink, importantly, is that almost 0.7 feet of sea level rise that was the backdrop on top of these storms, which caused them to cause unprecedented flooding. So if you look at kind of the tides, yes, the 13th was an astronomical high tide. It didn't have a particularly high or great storm surge, but on that backdrop of sea level rise is what caused that historic flooding. So we can expect to see more flooding like this because of the backdrop of rising seas. It's unlikely that we'll see that back-to-back nature of 2 of these extreme flooding events happening so close to one another. Next slide, please. So you've all probably heard many times about the rapid warming in the Gulf of Maine. It's warming 97 faster than global oceans, 3 times the rate of most other water bodies. A couple high points from the marine ecosystems chapter touches on kind of the changes in ocean circulation that are resulting in this rapid warming in the Gulf of Maine, including the shift of the Gulf Stream, which is pictured here in red. That's the warm current coming up from the south. You can imagine that we're kind of turning the faucet on the Gulf Stream while we are turning the faucet down on the Labrador Current. So this was a regime shift that really began in 2009, 2010, where we saw the influx of warm Gulf Stream water coming through the Northeast Channel, causing that rapid warming really in earnest from 2009, 10 to now. And that lower right figure is really showing sea surface temperatures in the Gulf of Maine, and Gulf of Maine Research Institute does a nice job of updating this every year. Next slide, please. Lastly, I wanted to talk about deoxygenation and acidification. There's been some updates in this year's scientific assessment on those two topics. So we know that increasing hypoxia, which is low oxygen in seawater, events in the Gulf of Maine are occurring more than they have in the past. In fact, they have resulted in lobster die-offs around Cape Cod. These die-offs have really attracted a lot of research to understand the environmental causes of these conditions and to do a better job of trying to predict them in advance. So hypoxia is affiliated with ocean acidification, with warming, with nutrient loading. It's more common in coastal areas. Furthermore, what I'm showing here on the bottom is that under the highest emission scenario, new models are showing the aragonite saturation state will be below critical levels for shellfish for most of the year by the year 2050. And this is going to make it difficult for them to build and maintain their shells and skeletons. So in short, fisheries in the Gulf of Maine, they're experiencing rapid change, as are the industries and communities that are dependent upon them. So with that in mind, we're going to move to the summary of the recommendations coming out of the Coastal and Marine Working Group. And as Ivy mentioned, I am going to be talking about the high-level recommendations coming out of the Fisheries and Aquaculture Subcommittee. So next slide, please. Okay, this is actually showing what Nick is going to talk about. So if you could just advance the slide, we're going to stick with me and then I'm going to hand it over to Nick. Perfect. Okay, so it's labeled 2 because of the order that it appears in the recommendations handout. So essentially, the Fisheries and Aquaculture Subcommittee has come up with some high-level recommendations characterized as you see here on the slide. And I'm going to read through this slide and the next one briefly, and then give you some examples of the action items that are coming out of these recommendations. So our subcommittee is striving to support climate adaptation of Maine's fisheries, aquaculture, and seafood industries. And the recommendations have kind of been divided up into six highlights, a few of which I'll expand upon in the next slide. So importantly, stewardship of resilient ecosystems, expanding equitable access, improving marine bioproduct innovation, taking advantage of diverse markets, supporting cultural, traditional, emerging and heritage industries, and workforce training. So these are some of the themes that you'll see if you read all of the detail that is within these recommendations. Next slide, please. Okay, so when you go to the actual survey to provide feedback on these recommendations, and Ivy's going to talk a little bit more about the survey at the end, but you will see this subcommittee's recommendations summarized within these kind of 2 overarching themes. The first one is promoting stewardship of climate resilient ecosystems to diversify markets and grow existing opportunities. This recommendation encourages advancing research, policies, and funding to help fisheries and ecosystems adapt to climate change while increasing the amount of local food consumed in Maine. So it's really about developing regulatory flexibility to allow small businesses to respond to change and potentially allow for fishery diversification. A few of the actionable recommendations that are included here are support and funding for Maine Department of Marine Resources to do continued monitoring, to really ramp up their climate vulnerability assessments. You'll see language around increasing local seafood to Maine people. And you'll see a lot of language around increasing bioproduct innovation. This is a really important recommendation. The second recommendation, from the perspective of the constituents that we work with at the Island Institute, may be even more important. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time on the second one. The second one is maintain and expand equitable access to cultural and traditional emerging and heritage industries. Now, this recommendation encourages strengthening natural resource and heritage industries by growing and diversifying skills and individuals in their workforce to support climate adaptation. And I can't actually see the bottom of the slide, but you can read it. So essentially, this second recommendation really strives to support communities in the face of ecological and regulatory uncertainty. And I think this is particularly important to remote coastal communities that have little economic diversity, and that is inclusive of Indigenous and cultural fishing practices. So the types of actions that you'll see outlined underneath this second recommendation include things like including fisheries and aquaculture and working waterfront initiatives in the list of approved community actions that are eligible for funding through the Community Resilience Partnership Funding Program. Some of you might be familiar with that funding program. That came out of the first iteration of Maine Won't Wait, and it provides $50,000 in funding to communities that are enrolled in the CRP or the Community Resilience Partnership. That $50,000 to date has been able to go to a list of activities, and this subcommittee is advocating for the inclusion of more fisheries, aquaculture, and working waterfront initiatives to be allowed to be paid for through that CRP funding. Other actions that you'll see highlighted here are increased public outreach and educational opportunities on climate resilience, really giving communities a sense of what climate resilience can look like for them. So providing examples and options of what is possible and what is available. The second big bucket that is included in this recommendation has to do with engaging with coastal communities to develop support strategies in response to socioeconomic impacts of regulatory uncertainty. Now that's kind of a mouthful, but what the regulatory uncertainty that is being referred to is largely around offshore wind development, largely around impacts of endangered right whale regulations on the lobster fishery. So it advocates for quantification of offshore wind development analysis on impacts on fisheries, on impacts on ecosystems. It advocates for continued surveys to quantify the movement of right whales and to develop management measures that include how risk to right whales will change as climate changes. And lastly, one thing that I thought was really insightful coming out of this subcommittee was it advocates for conflict resolution training for DMR staff and other staff working at the forefront of climate adaptation and resilience initiatives. So I encourage you to take a closer look at the recommendations proposed by this subcommittee. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Nick to talk about his subcommittee's work. Thank you.
Awesome. There we go. Thank you, Susie, and huge thank you to Ivy and the team at Friends of Casco Bay. I know that we've done a lot of good work together over the years, and I also know that, Ivy, you've spent a lot of time working on the Climate Council process and work, and it's really exciting to be here together with you talking about the Coastal Marine Working Group's work. Nick Battista, Chief Policy Officer at the Island Institute. I helped co-lead the Working Waterfront subgroup of the Coastal Marine Working Group of the Maine Climate Council. It is a mouthful, but really excited about the work that we were able to do and what came out of it. I love talking about working waterfronts. I know that some of you are been deeply involved in working waterfront issues in your community or your area. And it's incredible that the Coastal Marine Work Group recommendations were able to, hang on, sorry. Coastal Marine Working Group recommendations were able to make what I think is probably the best set of collected recommendations around how to support Maine's working waterfront infrastructure, build resilience, and support coastal communities that we have at the state at the moment. So without further ado, I will talk a little more about that. I have a little 7-year-old popping into the webinar here. You may see her see her popping in and out. Okay. Hang on a second. Sorry about that. A small person wants to join the webinar. So the working waterfront recommendations had 3 main areas of recommendation. The first one was increase the resilience of public and private working waterfronts. Second one was preserve access to working waterfront infrastructure. And the third one was recognizing, support local land use efforts and local efforts that can support working waterfront resilience, recognizing that Maine's working waterfront infrastructure is deeply connected. It's place-based infrastructure, it's in community, and community decisions are deeply connected to the future of working waterfront infrastructure. There are 2 important other notes that these recommendations were based on and that really are important to recognize in terms of changes in the policy landscape in Maine. The first one is a recognition that Maine has public and privately owned working waterfront infrastructure, and that these kinds of infrastructure need different strategies. They need different sources of funding, different ways of engaging, that the tools that you can use to build resilience and preserve public working waterfront infrastructure are different from those that you would use on private working waterfront infrastructure. And the second one was that working waterfronts themselves are places that are really important for the adaptation and really important for fisheries and aquaculture businesses as they grapple with climate change in the Gulf of Maine. All of those changes that Susie talked about are impacting fisheries businesses. If those fishing businesses don't have a strong working waterfront behind them, their ability to adapt and respond to those changes will be much less. And so, we saw some of this coming out of the storms in January. Island Institute supported 52 working waterfront businesses in an immediate response to the storm. And those businesses employed over 400 people on the working waterfront, but they supported more than 1,000 fishing boats that were all other businesses. And so the recommendations recognize that dependency. Really quickly, just sort of the 2 parts of the recommendations, like much of the work that we do around climate change and helping small communities or helping communities adapt to climate change, it's about 2 things. It's about providing the funding to do the planning and the work and the projects. And then it's all about the extra set of hands, the technical assistance, the other support work that goes along to make that funding useful. We know that even in our larger communities in the state, we don't always have the capacity to tackle these challenges. And so these recommendations all have a component of funding for the work itself, and then funding for the technical assistance and support. And then also in the working waterfront work, there's also a recognition that we need to do some baseline data collection, gather some information about the sector, provide some broader context for the work. And so the two places that I'd encourage you to weigh in on: increase the resilience of public and private working waterfront infrastructure to climate change. Funding is the big one. This is going to be millions of dollars. The state just put out $21 million to 68 working waterfronts to build their resilience following the storms. This came out last week or 2 weeks ago. That funding, definitely helps those businesses become more resilient and get ready for future storms. there's a whole bunch of working waterfronts that weren't eligible for that funding, and the really significant resilience upgrades that are going to be needed to protect the infrastructure long term are still going to be more expensive. And then preserving access to working waterfront, including intertidal access. This is a lot of where we need to be doing our homework as a sector who cares about working waterfronts, doing the inventories, the data collection, that work. There's a strategy development process, so the state would have a working waterfront strategy in there. This is a really important one too, and it's also about using the tools that we have as a state and identifying the tools that we would need to build in the future. So those are the big highlights of the recommendations. I'll turn it over to Ivy.
Thanks, Nick. Heather, will you please go to theme 3? There you go. Perfect. Just to echo what Nick was saying, the partnership between Friends of Casco Bay and Island Institute goes back a long ways, and we're very grateful to have them here with us and to share their expertise with us, because we all work in slightly different areas that complement one another and are so important to protecting our coastal and marine resources. So the third theme identified by the Coastal and Marine Working Group to the Climate Council was to monitor, conserve, and increase the resilience of coastal and marine ecosystems, because you're not going to have a working waterfront, you're not going to have healthy coastal communities, healthy fisheries without having excellent water quality and taking actions to preserve the critical habitats, especially nursery habitats for our fisheries, and really for our whole tourism industry. So there were 6 sort of recommendations under this third theme, or 6 strategies or actions under this third theme. These are the 6 that we identified. For all of the strategies that Susie, Nick, and I have been talking about, if you want kind of a summary chart in front of you, go to the Coastal Marine Working Group report. A link was shared in the chat, and go to pages 4 through 7 of that report. And that is like kind of a summary chart of these. And the reason why we're going through these is that in a few minutes, we'll share the survey with you that you can answer and provide feedback to the state on these recommendations. And that survey, because it's combining the recommendations of all 6 of the working groups, is super high level. So what's very important is that you add content in the comment section. And that's why Susie and Nick spent some time talking about what's really important under themes 1 and 2. So under theme 3, these are the 6 themes. Next slide, please. And of those 6 themes, the headings that you see here are the 3 choices that you will be asked to rank when you get to the survey. And the ones in yellow are the ones that I will ask you to consider prioritizing. The first is to enhance ongoing monitoring and data collection to guide decision making and fill data gaps. Okay, translate this. How can the Climate Council have the science it needs to make recommendations and to gauge whether the actions that we're taking, both from an environmental response and social response, are working, or if we need to adjust it? And that is through monitoring. And the monitoring may be to answer questions that we haven't come up with, or to provide data sets so that we can look at how an environment is and how it is changing. The new piece, and this is in response to the storms that Susie talked about, is that this working group recommended that we begin to document the effects of extreme events like the storms this winter. So we have a before and after, and can begin to think about that better in our planning for the future. So consider please prioritizing this when you complete the survey, and add a comment that it's important to document the effects of these extreme events. The second theme that of the 6 that you'll only be given these 3 to prioritize is protecting our habitats. What's pictured here is eelgrass habitat. Eelgrass is like an essential, it's designated federally as an essential fish habitat. And it is so important to so many of our commercially valuable species and to coastal resilience because it protects against storm surge. That's just one of the many habitats. And we can't just try to protect these habitats because they're not going to exist exactly as they did in the past with response to storm surge, sea level rise, changing ocean temperatures, all that kind of things. And so we really need to experiment with how to make these habitats resilient. So the third choice you'll be given is expand outreach to offer information and provide technical assistance. That is important, but if we can't prioritize everything, the first two steps are most important, because if we don't have good data, if we don't have successful pilot projects, how can we provide technical assistance to communities figuring it out? And by we, I mean the royal we, the state and the outside partners that it does a lot of the collaborative research with. So at this point, cognizant of the time, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah and invite Susie and Nick to come back on camera so that she can share with you how to complete the survey, and we can answer your questions while you're looking at the survey.
Thanks so much, Ivy. So the idea now is I'm going to share my screen and show you all how to fill out the survey. It's pretty quick, and we would love for you all to join us. The link is in the chat. If you would like to at least look at it and spend a few minutes filling it out while you're on the webinar. For the rest of the time, after I show you kind of what the survey looks like and how to fill it out, we will have the opportunity for question and answer. So you're welcome to ask questions about what the three panelists already talked about. And then, of course, once you see the survey, you can ask specific questions about the survey as well. So when you click the link, this is what you are going to see. This is just a little blip introducing the survey. And just as a reminder to orient people, this survey specifically is on the Coastal and Marine Working Group. So all of the issues that we just talked about. The Maine Climate Council does have a survey for the rest of the working groups as well, and we will share that link with you as well. But today, as you know, we are focused on coastal and marine. So on this screen, you just want to hit next. And here is the actual survey. So as you can see, there are 8 of these questions where it asks you to rank how would each of these strategies fit into your community, from a great fit to not a good fit. And Ivy, Susie, and Nick just talked about some of these strategies. To orient you, the first 3 strategies are what Nick talked about: working waterfront, communities, and infrastructure. The next 2 strategies are about the seafood industry and fisheries. That's what Susie talked about. And the last 3 strategies are about ecosystems and science data collection, which Ivy talked about. And then, of course, at the very bottom, there are some comment boxes, which we alluded to. Although the metrics are very helpful, whether it's a good fit or not for your community, where you really get the most bang for your buck is in these comment sections at the end. So take a couple minutes to look at these, and we will start to answer any questions that you all have. Okay, so one question is that some of the attendees live in communities that have experienced significant erosion. What recommendations do you have for them, and are there groups offering consultations?
I took a stab at that one in the chat, Sarah. So there are specific actions related to tackling bluff erosion, specifically in both the Coastal and Marine Working Group recommendations and in the Community Resilience Working Group recommendations. There is a lot of overlap between the 6 working group recommendations, and that's one example of where you'll see a particular issue coming up across working groups. But as far as answering Sue's question, there is a pretty large movement in the state around, really led by the Department of Environmental Protection, around arming coastal property owners with additional strategies other than just putting up bulkheads and other hard infrastructure that can have negative kind of downstream consequences for neighbors and adjacent waterfront. And so that is currently in the works. There'll be a publicly available guide for homeowners coming out shortly. Nathan Robbins at the Department of Environmental Protection is a good place to start there. And then as far as like neighborhood support, the Casco Bay Islands Alliance has been advancing this work and hosting a couple different field trip last fall, and then an event recently that was at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, where several of our colleagues and myself spoke to, and I know several people were in attendance that are on the webinar here today. So there was a lot of great information coming out of that symposium on this very topic, and it will be compiled into a toolkit and shared publicly over the course of this year.
That was an excellent answer. The other resource is the Department of Marine Resources, the Maine Coastal Program. They're probably collaborating with the Department of Environmental Protection, but they also have a lot of focus on this and are doing work in Casco Bay.
Another question is, how do you get more working waterfronts?
It's a great question. And it's one of those that we love to hear, because so often we're focused on just preserving what we have, and that's really important. And we have to do that. We've also seen instances in the last 10 years of growth of working waterfronts. And so whether it's improvements at existing working waterfronts that help expand their capacity or their ability to deal with changes in the fishery or aquaculture businesses, that helps expand access to working waterfronts. Another example, the Sprucehead Co-op took over a house next door to them. The house came up for sale. And so instead of a working waterfront going to a house, they took a house and turned it into a working waterfront. They needed space to expand. There are a couple of places on the Damariscotta River where privately owned wharfs have been turned into docks that support commercial aquaculture operations. And then I think the other really big one is in Portland and Belfast. We've seen the expansion of boatyards into historic brownfield areas or other areas that were less well utilized. And those boatyards are providing really important services for the marine industries in Maine, both the fisheries and aquaculture businesses, and then also the marine construction and other businesses that rely on them, as well as all of the pleasure and other boats they deal with. So yeah, we want more working waterfronts.
I would agree with you, Nick. And when Sarah first asked the question, the first thing that came to mind was the ABBA lyric, like money, money, money. It's really important to have funding for working waterfront. And so Land for Maine's Future and other programs like that are really important to support. And I believe both of our organizations support that. And I know in the Casco Bay watershed, the Land for Maine's Future Fund has been really instrumental in preserving access to the working waterfront. We couldn't even do our water quality monitoring in a lot of locations without those locations.
Absolutely. And I would just add that also highlights the importance of shoreside paths. So access to the shore, really important for clammers, really important for wormers, other folks who work on the shore, Casco Bay monitors, all of that. And that also is working waterfront infrastructure in the state's view. And so expanding access to the shore is part of it.
What might we envision as a tangible outcome if these recommendations are included in the next climate action plan?
I'm happy to start. I think it's a multifaceted answer. One of the really exciting things that happened a couple of weeks ago, two really exciting things. The state awarded $21 million to 68 working waterfront businesses to build their resilience and help them recover from the storms. And so that's a small drop in the bucket. We would expect to see more funding like that and going to greater, more resilience efforts. And then the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future applied for a $69 million grant from NOAA for regional climate resilience building. And it's a statewide project over 5 years. There's a strong working waterfront component that builds on the recommendations or was developed contemporaneously with the recommendations in the Coastal Marine Working Group. And so there is now funding to support the inventories and the assessments, and there's capacity to help people understand what resilience upgrades on working waterfronts look like and the engineering support for how to do that. And so that grant is probably the start of the implementation. If we had another, 5 or 10 people in this sector working on working waterfront resilience in the next few years, that would be awesome. Plus millions of dollars to actually do the work.
Susie, do you want to go next?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think from the Fisheries and Aquaculture Subcommittee's perspective, I think, and really the Coastal Marine Working Group as a whole, I think if these recommendations are implemented, I think it will be a great step forward in kind of turning on the headlights for what is to come around ocean climate change in the Gulf of Maine and how that impacts fisheries and fishing dependent communities. So one of the recommendations I talked a lot about was preparing communities for regulatory uncertainty. And I think, a lot of the recommendations are about increased funding and diversification of businesses that are really on the front lines of experiencing climate change, whether they're fisheries dependent businesses or not. So I think with that enhanced monitoring and an understanding of what's to come, and then funds spent to prepare communities for that change and make them more climate ready is a huge priority, I think, for the next 4 years.
Under monitoring and habitats, and I know we've got a minute left, so I'll go quickly. I think it's the mapping and data collection is critically important, so that we exactly know how much habitat we're losing and can study why and can try to make efforts to protect our valuable natural coastal environments. So I'm gonna leave it at that and say, as I turn it back over to Sarah to wrap this up, that ask yourselves this question and put the comments in there. What is very important to you? You've heard some of what's very important to us as people working on this working group and trying to speak on your behalf and on behalf of the environment. But this is really your time to talk about this. So please reach out to any of the three of us. We can make sure you have our contact information, and complete the survey or submit more detailed comments if that's what you choose to do. Sarah, back to you to conclude us. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ivy. So just as a reminder, we are going to send a follow-up email likely later today with another link to the survey. And then we will be sending a recording of this as well as a summary of the priority recommendations to you all as well. And the survey is due mid-September, but we do encourage you, while this is all fresh in your mind, to just take a few minutes and fill it out. And as Ivy said, please reach out if you have questions, and we'll try to address some of your questions as well in our follow-up email that we send next week or the week after. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you to Susie and Nick and Ivy for taking the time this morning, and I hope you all have a great Thursday.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.